The history books tell us that the great story of humanity is by now almost complete, that every rise and fall, every empire and kingdom, every forgotten tribe and defiant rebellion has been accounted for, neatly catalogued in the archives of our collective memory. It's a comforting idea that the past is mapped and measured, that nothing of importance has escaped the eyes of scholars. We picture history as a completed puzzle, with every piece found and fitted into place. But every so often, an edge of the puzzle warps. A missing shape becomes visible, not because we suddenly find it, but because the surrounding pieces, the civilizations we know, begin to feel incomplete. That is where this story begins, with the strange hollow in our past where an entire civilization should be. Not a small, obscure culture on the fringes of the ancient world, but a people whose presence should have been impossible to ignore. And yet they are gone not only from the land, but from memory, erased, so completely that their name does not survive in any chronicle, any royal ledger, any carved tablet that we can openly acknowledge. Even the myths that once hinted at their existence have been softened, diluted, and buried beneath layers of cultural retelling until they seem like nothing more than bedtime stories. Still traces remain: a crumbling wall that aligns with no known kingdoms, borders, a harbor built for ships larger than any recorded fleet, pottery whose patterns match nothing from the surrounding regions, yet whose clay comes from their soil. These fragments appear like whispers, breaking through the static of history, brief, dissonant, and quickly smothered. How can something so vast disappear so quietly? History is filled with destruction, but it is rarely silent. The collapse of Rome echoed for centuries in the laws, languages, and architecture it left behind. The Maya abandoned cities, but their descendants still walk the jungles. The kingdoms of Mesopotamia were conquered and renamed, but their records survive in clay. When civilizations fall, they leave shadows. Their influence lingers in trade, in speech, in bloodlines. But this civilization left nothing: no shadows, no fingerprints, only an absence so precise it feels surgical. The land they once held is not unknown to us. In fact, it lies between some of the most well-documented ancient powers in the world. Empires whose scribes meticulously recorded battles, harvests, taxes, births, and deaths. These were cultures that cataloged even the most minor of neighboring tribes, and yet in the records of these empires, the region where this civilization stood is an empty space, a blank map. It is as though the chroniclers, when writing their world, simply drew a curtain over this place and moved on. For centuries, scholars treated this blankness as unremarkable. Not every people leave a record, they said. Not every culture shapes the course of history, but as archaeology advanced, as ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging began to strip away the Earth's camouflage, that explanation began to crumble. Beneath the fields and forests, the unmistakable grid of a city emerged, and not just a city, but a planned metropolis, older and more advanced in some respects than the capitals of its better-known neighbors, wide avenues lined with what appeared to be multi-story stone structures, complex drainage systems that still guide rainwater, thousands of years after the last human walked those streets. Monumental. Foundations suggesting temples, palaces, or something we have no modern word for. These were not the traces of a minor culture. These were the fingerprints of a people with vision engineering mastery and the ability to marshal vast labor forces, a people who traded, who governed, who built with permanence in mind. And yet their name is gone. Their rulers, their language, their wars, their victories, their defeats, all gone. As though someone had not merely toppled their cities, but reached into the human story itself and torn their chapter from the book. The more evidence emerges, the more impossible the silence becomes. Pottery shards carry pigments from minerals mined hundreds of miles away. Proof of far-reaching trade networks. Jewelry, features gemstones cut with techniques that should not have existed for another millennium. And yet, when these finds are presented, they are often quietly reclassified, attributed to cultural influence from unrelated peoples, as if the thought of this civilization standing on its own is unacceptable. Why? Why would history be rewritten to make them vanish? Natural disasters erase cities, but not names. Conquest erases leaders, but not lineages. Disease can empty a land, but it does not empty. The records of those who once filled it, erasure on this scale, suggests intent, the deliberate smothering of a memory so dangerous, so threatening to the victors or the historians, that even centuries later the wound in history must remain stitched shut. And this is where the story turns from curiosity to warning. If history can erase something so large, what else might we be missing? If an entire civilization could be swept from the record without the world noticing, then how much of our known past is simply what we have been allowed to know? Perhaps history as we inherit it is not the complete puzzle we imagine, but a curated display, a version of events shaped by those with the power to decide what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. As we step into this investigation, we are not simply chasing a name lost to time. We are probing the boundaries of truth itself. Every artifact we examine, every anomaly we uncover, will be measured against the story we were taught in school. And every time they do not match, we will be faced with the same uncomfortable question. If this civilization could be erased from every history book, then how real is the history we think we know? This is not an easy journey. The deeper we dig, the more resistance we encounter from archives that refuse access to expeditions, that vanish into bureaucratic silence. We will walk through lands where the official guides speak in careful rehearsed sentences and where locals still whisper of the people before the ones in the books. We will follow the faint trail of their existence through myth trade, ruin and rumor, piecing together a portrait from scraps that survived the fire of forgetting. And as the outline of this lost civilization sharpens, we will confront the possibility that their disappearance was not the result of one disaster, but a long campaign of erasure that outlived them by centuries. A campaign waged not with swords alone, but with ink, with silence, and with the authority to decide what counts as history. This is the first step into the hollow in our past. A hollow so large, once you see it, you will never be able to unsee it. What follows is the story of the civilization erased from every history book and why someone somewhere wanted it gone forever. If the first sign of this civilization's absence was the silence in written history, the second sign was the noise it left in the margins, scattered fragments so inconsistent, so out of place, that they were long dismissed as coincidence. You don't find these clues in official chronicles or grand stone inscriptions. You find them in the whispers of unrelated cultures, in footnotes buried at the back of 19th century travelogues, in museum drawers labeled unclassified origin. The fragments are not abundant, but they are persistent, surfacing in times and places that make no sense unless they belong to a people whose reach once extended far beyond what we have been told. One of the earliest hints comes from a fragment of a clay tablet, discovered not in the supposed homeland of this lost civilization, but hundreds of miles away in the ruins of a well-documented empire. The language is one we can read, but the text itself is puzzling, a record of tribute paid to the Mountain Kings, an entity that does not appear anywhere else in the empire's archives. Even more strange, the tribute list contains items the empire itself did not produce: a rare blue dye, a type of grain unknown in the region, and a finely worked metal ingot of a composition centuries ahead of its time. If these mountain kings were merely a minor tribe, why would a major empire trade for goods they could neither produce nor obtain elsewhere? And why, after this one fleeting reference, do they vanish entirely from the written record? Similar anomalies crop up across the ancient world. A shard of pottery in one museum matches the exact pigment style of a decorated tablet in another. Yet the two are found continents apart. A legend, recorded by a coastal fishing village, tells of ships with wings like birds arriving once a year to trade obsidian for amber. The same ships appear in the folktales of an inland river culture, an impossible connection, unless there was once a shared route between them. And then there are the symbols repeating geometric designs, carved into stone lintels in one region, pressed into clay seals, in another painted onto pottery, in a third, all linked by a stylistic fingerprint, unique enough to suggest a common origin, but never officially attributed to any known culture. The contrast with known history is stark. When the Phoenicians traded across the Mediterranean, their artifacts left a trail clear enough to map. When the Silk Road linked east and west, the flow of goods and styles could be traced like threads through fabric. Yet here we have the threads without the fabric, connections without the recognized source. It is as though the loom itself has been burned, leaving only scraps tangled in the ruins of other civilizations. Some fragments are not material at all, but linguistic. Linguists studying the oldest layers of certain regional languages have found a handful of words for tools, for weather, for kinship that seem to come from nowhere. They do not match the neighboring tongues, nor do they belong to any known linguistic family. They stand alone like orphaned syllables. In living memory, these words have no origin, they simply are. But in the context of the ruins, they may be the last surviving echoes of a language no one now speaks. And then there is the question of myth. Myth has a strange persistence. It can preserve the memory of real events for thousands of years, albeit in altered form. In the Highlands, elders tell of the people of the black stone who built walls that sang in the wind. In the lowlands, the fishermen speak of the pale kings who came from the mountains and returned there when the sea swallowed their harbors. The details shift, the symbols mutate. But the spine of the story remains a great people here once now gone. Historians often treat such myths as coincidence or archetype, the universal pattern of rise and fall repeated across the globe. And yet, when these tales are compared side by side, certain details align too precisely to be dismissed. The same number of great rivers in three separate traditions. The same description of a sky fire that ended an age. The same morning song recorded generations apart with a melody nearly identical across cultures that supposedly never met. In the margins of history, these fragments are like constellations waiting to be connected. But here lies the problem. To draw the lines between them is to admit that the official map is wrong, that there is an entire chapter missing. And for centuries, scholars have preferred to treat these anomalies as curiosities rather than clues. Each fragment alone can be explained away together. They form a pattern too dangerous to acknowledge. And so the fragments remain scattered. A bronze figurine with no known cultural origin kept in storage and rarely displayed. A coastal ruin mapped in the 1920s, mislabeled as natural formations in official surveys. A collection of ancient seeds locked in a university lab, their DNA tracing to no documented source. Individually, they are oddities. Collectively, they are fingerprints on a glass, faint, partial, but undeniable. The contrast is not only between the known and the unknown, but between what survives in the open and what survives in secret. In museum basements and private collections, artifacts with no official history often go unstudied, as if to examine them would be to open a door best left shut. And in remote communities, myths that could hold keys to the past are dying, with their last storytellers unheard by the world beyond their borders. This is why the trail is so hard to follow. The evidence is not gathered in one place but scattered across continents, languages, and disciplines. To find, it requires not just archaeology, but anthropology, linguistics, geology, and a willingness to question the neat narrative of the past. It requires, above all, the refusal to look away when a fragment refuses to fit, for in the end, it is not the absence of evidence that hides this civilization from us. It is the distribution of evidence scattered just far enough apart, buried just deep enough in other people's histories, that only by stepping back and seeing the whole sky can we notice the missing constellation. And when we do, we realize that the fragments are not just the edges of memory, they are the key to unlocking what lies beyond it. Maps are in many ways the bones of history. They do not merely tell us where things are, they tell us what mattered enough to be recorded. In the hands of ancient cartographers, a coastline was not drawn because it existed, but because it was known, claimed or feared. Every mountain, sketched, every river traced, was an act of recognition, which makes it all the more unsettling when a place appears on old maps not once, but repeatedly, and then vanishes from every version that follows. The first time researchers noticed the anomaly, it was in the leather-bound charts of a merchant fleet from a now-vanished medieval trading guild. The maps were otherwise meticulous ports, matched archaeological evidence, trade winds aligned with historical weather records. But in a certain coastal stretch, there was a city that should not have been there. Its name, written in bold ink, was unknown to history. The surrounding notation suggested it was a hub of commerce marked with symbols for warehouses, shipyards, and markets. But in modern atlases of the ancient world, this same coastline is left bare. At first, it was dismissed as an error, perhaps the cartographer's imagination or a misplaced label from a distant port. But then another map surfaced. Centuries older, copied from a source the mapmaker claimed to have inherited from the seakeepers. The same city appeared again. Same location. Same harbor outline. This time, the coastline was flanked by mountains whose ridges, when compared with modern satellite imagery, matched perfectly. There could be no mistake in location. The real shock came when scholars began to notice the pattern, not just one phantom city, but several scattered across a narrow belt of territory. Sometimes they bore different names as if filtered through the tongues of various traders. Sometimes they appeared only as symbols marked with the ancient sign for city of tribute or royal port, and then in the next centuries, maps they were gone. Not faded or renamed, gone. Entire. Stretches of populated land replaced with empty space or vague markings like unknown or wilderness. The contrast with well-documented cities of the era is jarring. When cities like Tyre or Alexandria were sacked, their names still appeared on maps. For centuries afterward, even in ruins, they might be labeled deserted or destroyed, but their memory remained fixed in the geography of the world. This mysterious network of ports and inland trade hubs, however, seems to have been intentionally erased from the cartographic record in a single generational sweep. As if a silent decree had gone out among mapmakers, these places no longer exist. And they never did. That idea would seem paranoid if not for the curious fate of those who tried to chart them later. In the early 1700s, a Jesuit scholar traveling through the region reported finding an ancient map on cloth in a monastery archive depicting not only the coastline, but an entire river network and inland capital. He sent sketches of it to colleagues in Europe. Weeks later, the monastery caught fire, destroying its archives. The Jesuit's letters ceased abruptly, and when his companions returned, they found his rooms cleared of his papers. This was not an isolated incident. Explorers in the 19th century who marked these forgotten cities on their own survey maps found their work quietly corrected by publishers before release. In one case, the corrections were so thorough that the expedition's surviving map is the only evidence. The surveyors ever placed the city there at all. The official publication replaced it with hills and forested marsh, despite first-hand descriptions of paved streets and crumbling stone walls. Why would maps be altered this way? One answer is politics. boundaries drawn and redrawn to favor ruling powers, erasing the claims of extinct peoples. Another is ideology, religious authorities shaping geography to fit sacred narratives, erasing any land whose history might contradict doctrine. But the sheer scale of erasure here hints at something more coordinated, something that required compliance across centuries and cultures. This coordination is most visible in maritime charts. Ancient seafaring cultures often shared navigational knowledge, trading map data at ports, much as they traded goods. To remove a port from every such chart would require more than a few kingdoms agreeing on a lie. It would require the sustained suppression of information across rival powers, often at odds in every other domain. Yet the evidence shows it happened. The once busy harbors of this lost civilization are absent, not just from their conquerors' maps, but from the maps of their competitors, their enemies, even distant civilizations with no political stake in their erasure. In some rare cases, the cartographic ghosts reveal themselves through human error. A scribe copying an old map might preserve a place name accidentally, only for it to vanish in the next edition. In the archives of a northern kingdom, one such error survived a small island labeled with a name found nowhere else. Linguists, comparing the name to fragments from ancient inscriptions, noted a startling match to the lost civilization's suspected language family. The island itself is uninhabited today, but stone foundations still cling to its cliffs, weathered by centuries of wind and spray. This is the duality of the forbidden cartographers. Their work both reveals and conceals. Every map is a negotiation between knowledge and power. What we inherit as geography is often a palimpsest, a rewritten surface, hiding layers beneath. The contrast is sharp. When you hold two maps side by side, one centuries old boldly labeling a thriving city, the other newer and official replacing it with emptiness. In that emptiness, we glimpse the outlines of what was lost and the human hands that made it disappear. What makes this erasure so haunting is that maps are supposed to be our defense against forgetting. They fix a place in the world, give it coordinates, anchor it in memory. To delete a place from a map is to strike it from reality in the eyes of everyone who follows. And in the case of this civilization, that deletion was so thorough that for hundreds of years, no one even knew the maps were wrong. But the land remembers satellite imaging in recent decades has traced the ghost outlines of vanished harbors, now silted over but still visible from the air. Inland faint crop marks reveal the grids of buried streets where soil fertility changes with the foundations beneath. These new maps, digital incorruptible, are beginning to redraw the lines that were once erased. And in doing so, they force us to confront the question that haunts every vanished label, every blank space left where a city should be. If the cartographers were forbidden to show these places, what else were they forbidden to reveal? If the maps whispered of what once was the ground itself, speaks more plainly, though it does so in a language only the patient can hear. Beneath fields now tilled for grain, beneath forests that have stood for centuries, beneath quiet villages whose people know nothing of the past, under their feet lie the bones of cities, and when the soil is peeled back, the echoes of a civilization erased from history rise like ghosts into the light. The first of these echoes came not from an archaeological expedition, but from an accident. A farmer digging a new irrigation trench struck something hard, not the usual stone, but a smooth, fitted block heavier than any rock in the region. Pulling it free revealed not just one stone, but a wall its face, polished and set with a precision his tools could not match. Authorities were called, and soon a small excavation was underway. The trench widened into a street straight paved and flanked on both sides by the remains of structures whose walls had been sheared off by centuries of soil. These were not crude shelters. Even in ruin, the architecture spoke of an orderliness, a design that stretched beyond simple survival. Doorways were aligned with the cardinal directions, Foundations were raised, above street level, suggesting knowledge of flooding. Beneath the paving stones ran a network of channels still capable of carrying water. This was not the work of an isolated village. This was a city planned by minds that understood both beauty and engineering. More digs followed. In one site, archaeologists uncovered the outline of a massive public square, its edges marked by colonnades of stone columns, some still standing upright despite the centuries. In another, they found the remnants of a bathhouse, complete with heating systems that predated similar designs in better-known cultures by hundreds of years. Scattered among these ruins were artifacts of startling craftsmanship, tools of copper alloy with edges sharper than bronze decorative tiles glazed with colors that had not faded, and fragments of statues carved from stone quarried far from the region. The contrast with the official history is jarring. According to accepted timelines, no civilization in this area should have possessed such urban complexity at the time these ruins were built. There should have been scattered settlements, perhaps modest forts, but nothing approaching the scale of what the soil now revealed. And yet here it was, undeniable, immovable, too large to dismiss as coincidence. The deeper the excavations went, the more the city spoke. Its streets formed a grid, a rarity in ancient planning. The houses were uniform in dimension but varied in decoration, suggesting a society that valued both equality and individuality. Workshops yielded evidence of specialized trades, jewelers, weavers, metalworkers, each clustered in distinct districts, and in the center of it all foundations so massive they could have supported structures larger than anything else in the city, temples, palaces, or perhaps something stranger. But the most haunting discoveries came not from the buildings, but from the soil layers beneath them. Beneath the lowest streets, beneath the earliest walls lay an even, older layer of habitation, simple stone huts, hearths for cooking tools carved from bone and antler. It was as if the city had been built atop the ruins of an earlier settlement, a continuity of occupation stretching back far longer than the official histories would allow. Here was evidence that this site had been significant for millennia, a heartbeat of human activity in the same place long before it reached its height, and then it stopped. In the uppermost layers, the signs of life suddenly vanish. No gradual decline, no evidence of a slow collapse. One season, the city was bustling, and the next it was gone. The streets filled with wind-blown soil, the buildings crumbled, the channels dried. In some places it seemed as if people had simply walked away, leaving tools half-finished and food storage jars still sealed. No mass graves have been found, no signs of a devastating fire or widespread battle scars. Just absence as clean and complete as the silence in the history books. In other regions, ruins have been found where the destruction is less gentle. Buildings torn down, deliberately stones carted away to be reused elsewhere. Foundations, shattered walls, toppled in ways that speak of deliberate dismantling rather than decay. It is as if someone not only wanted to remove the people, but to erase the city itself from the land to ensure it could never be rebuilt. The soil carries more than stone. In one excavation, archaeologists found hundreds of small clay tokens buried beneath the floor of a structure, each marked with an unfamiliar symbol. These were not currency. They were too uniform, too symbolic. They may have been ritual objects or perhaps records of trade or law. The symbols match no known script, yet they recur with the regularity of a true writing system. Linguists who have seen them privately admit that they may represent a language wholly unconnected to any in the region, a linguistic isolate like a voice with no family. Other sites yield hints of advanced knowledge in fields we would not expect. Pottery shards show evidence of glazes fired at temperatures thought impossible for the time. Metallurgical analysis of tools reveals alloys that required complex smelting techniques, some incorporating trace elements in ways modern engineers recognize as deliberate, not accidental. These finds do not fit comfortably into the known technological sequence of the region's history, which may explain why they are rarely displayed to the public. The contrast between the clarity of the physical evidence and the refusal of official narratives to adapt is striking. We are told that archaeology is a self-correcting science, that new discoveries refine our understanding of the past. And yet here, the ruins themselves seem to have been absorbed quietly into other narratives. Their dates adjusted, their origins misattributed until they become invisible in plain sight. But the soil does not lie. Every stone, every shard, every buried foundation is a voice from the past speaking in the language of place. And when enough of these voices are heard together, they form a chorus that cannot be mistaken. There was a civilization here, one that built with skill, traded with distant lands, and vanished, with a suddenness that defies explanation, and still the echoes continue to surface. Farmers plow up pottery. Construction crews strike buried walls. Floods expose steps leading into the earth where no building stands above ground. Each new find is a reminder that the land remembers, even when our books do not. And each discovery deepens the mystery, not just of how this civilization lived, but of why it had to be erased. From the cartographers' vanished cities to the archaeologists' silent streets, we are beginning to see the outline of a truth too large to ignore. And as we push deeper, the soil may yet yield its most dangerous secret, the reason this chapter of human history was torn from the book. Archaeology thrives on dates. Every shard, every bone, every layer of soil has its place in time, and those placements form the backbone of history as we know it. The confidence of our historical timelines rests on the belief that these dates are correct, that the sequence of human events is anchored firmly to the clock of science, which is why nothing is more dangerous to an established narrative than a discovery that refuses to fit into its assigned slot. The ruins beneath the soil had already shaken belief in the official story, but when samples from those ruins were tested, they didn't just challenge the timeline, they threatened to upend it entirely. The first blow came from carbon dating, charcoal recovered from a hearth inn. The city's central district returned a date thousands of years older than any known settlement of comparable sophistication in the region. At first, the lab assumed contamination, that newer material had seeped into older layers, or that the sample had been mislabeled. But multiple independent tests confirmed the result. These buildings were older than the civilizations. We are told influenced them. And it wasn't an isolated case. Wooden beams from another site preserved by a landslide dated to the same implausible era. The structures they came from displayed masonry techniques that should not have existed for several centuries afterward, a contradiction that left experts with only two choices: either revise the accepted technological timeline or declare the evidence anomalous and quietly set it aside. The latter choice more often than not prevailed. The pattern repeated itself across multiple sites. Sediment analysis placed flood deposits over certain ruins at dates long before. Known regional floods pollen records revealed agricultural activity centuries before the earliest recorded farming in that area. Even the orientation of the city's streets hinted at deep time, aligned not to the current position of the stars, but to where they would have been thousands of years ago, a subtle but measurable drift caused by the Earth's axial precession. The contrast with established history could not be sharper. The conventional story paints this part of the world as a latecomer to urbanization, borrowing its technologies and ideas from older, more advanced centers elsewhere. Yet here was evidence of a society designing cities, mastering metallurgy, and managing complex agriculture before those older centers even rose to prominence. This is why the timeline is inconvenient. It does not merely shift dates by a few decades, it inverts the order of influence. It suggests that what we think of as peripheral may in fact have been central, that the teachers of history may once have been the students, and the students, the teachers. And if that is true, then the flow of civilization, as we have been taught from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean from Egypt outward, may be only part of the story. The resistance to such a revision is fierce. Timelines are not just academic constructs. They are foundations upon which careers, institutions, and entire national identities are built. To admit that a backwater once rivaled or surpassed the acknowledged cradles of civilization is to undermine centuries of scholarship and the authority of those who guard it. There is also the problem of what older dates imply. If these cities truly flourished thousands of years earlier than accepted history allows, then they survived for an extraordinarily long time before vanishing. That longevity raises uncomfortable questions. How could such an advanced and enduring society disappear without leaving an undeniable cultural legacy? And if they did influence others, why has that influence been so carefully erased from the record? Some researchers working outside official channels have pursued these questions with cutting-edge methods. Thermoluminescence dating of ceramics, for example, measures the time since clay was last fired. In one case, it confirmed that a storage jar from the ruins had been in use more than a millennium earlier than its official classification allowed. Isotope analysis of human remains suggested trade and migration patterns inconsistent, with the accepted chronology people moving between this civilization and distant lands at a time when supposedly no such contact was possible. Satellite-based surveys add another wrinkle by mapping subtle changes in vegetation and soil coloration. Researchers have traced the outlines of additional settlements buried far beyond the known ruins. The layouts suggest a long, continuous tradition of city building, one that spans eras, which according to official history should be separated by cultural collapse or technological stagnation. And yet, despite the accumulating evidence, the timeline in textbooks remains unchanged. In conferences and journals, the anomalies are treated as errors to be corrected rather than signals to be followed. A carbon date that comes back too early is assumed to be flawed. An artifact that seems too advanced is labeled an outlier. The official record adjusts reality to fit itself rather than adjusting itself to fit reality. But the soil and the stars keep telling the same story. The precision of the city's astronomical alignments cannot be dismissed as chance. The drift of constellations across millennia is predictable, and by reversing it, we can pinpoint the era when the city's planners must have been at work. The result matches the carbon dates and the sediment layers. This civilization was old, far older than we are permitted to believe. The implications ripple outward. If they were this old, then they may have been a formative influence on cultures. We consider their betters. If they were this advanced, then our entire model of technological progression, slow, steady, cumulative, is called into question. And if they could be so completely erased, then perhaps other civilizations have been as well, their contributions swallowed by the shifting sands of time and the deliberate hands of those who control the past. The inconvenient timeline is more than a historical puzzle. It is a challenge to our faith in the permanence of truth. It forces us to consider that history is not a single unbroken chain, but a tapestry with missing threads that if restored might reveal a pattern we no longer recognize. And so the question grows sharper with every dig, every test, every anomaly. If the clock of history is wrong here, where else might it be wrong? How many more dates might shift if we allowed the evidence to speak for itself? And how different might our understanding of ourselves be if we did? Every civilization leaves behind a voice. Sometimes it's in the form of epic poems etched into stone. Sometimes it's in tax ledgers shipping manifests or prayers scratched onto pottery shards. Language is the thread that binds a people to their memory. And when that thread is cut, the past begins to fray. For this lost civilization, The thread has not only been cut, it has been hidden. The first traces of their language came from clay tablets unearthed near the heart of one of the buried cities. The symbols impressed into their surfaces were not merely decorative. They had the rhythm, the repetition, the complexity of true writing, a system designed to convey meaning across time. And yet, when experts were asked to classify it, the response was oddly restrained, unidentified. They said, possibly proto-writing. It was a curious label. The same patterns of repetition, symmetry, and variation in other contexts, such as the scripts of ancient Sumer or the Indus Valley, had been enough to earn full recognition as language. But here the symbols were pushed into the category of possible suspended in scholarly limbo. The reluctance becomes more puzzling when you examine the details. The script is composed of clean, deliberate lines and curves, arranged in horizontal rows. Certain symbols appear in predictable contexts, suggesting they may represent numbers, titles, or recurring concepts. Others are complex composites, two or more simple signs combined to form a new one, a hallmark of mature writing systems. There are even what appear to be punctuation marks, guiding how the reader should pause or group ideas. The contrast with known scripts is stark. When linear bead tablets were first found in Crete, scholars raced to decode them, eager to claim the prestige of deciphering an ancient tongue. The Rosetta Stone sparked an intellectual arms race to crack Egyptian hieroglyphs, but with this language, no such race exists. In fact, most of the researchers who have handled these artifacts have done so in isolation, publishing only brief notes, often buried in obscure journals. The work of connecting them into a coherent corpus, the lifeblood of decipherment, has simply not been done. Why some claim there are too few examples to work, with but field reports tell a different story. Dozens of inscribed tablets and storage wall carvings, half buried in soil seal stones found in graves. Photographs of these finds have leaked into small academic circles, yet many have never been displayed to the public. A few scholars speaking anonymously admit that permission to study the pieces is often denied or delayed indefinitely. The symbols themselves offer tantalizing clues. One recurring sign resembles a sun with rays always placed at the start of inscriptions, perhaps a marker for the beginning of a text, or a symbol of royal or divine authority. Another, shaped like a stepped pyramid, appears alongside what may be numerical signs, possibly denoting quantities or measurements. There are signs for fish, for birds, for mountain peaks, or at least shapes that evoke them, suggesting a language grounded in the natural world, yet capable of abstraction. Some linguists have noted faint parallels to unrelated scripts thousands of miles away. A curved character here resembles one from the ancient coastlines of a distant sea. A cross-hatched diamond there appears in both. But these similarities are not proof of connection. They are only hints, the kind that make the question more complex. Was this language a complete isolate or part of a far-flung family long since broken apart? The human element deepens the mystery. In one burial site, a stone pendant was found, engraved with 3 symbols from the script. It was strung on a cord beside the bones of an adult male, suggesting it had personal significance, perhaps a name, a title, or a protective charm. In another grave, a small clay disc bore an inscription around its rim, too faint to read fully but clearly deliberate. These were not casual markings. They were the written voice of a people who wanted to be remembered, and yet no one claims them. To claim a language in the academic sense is to take on its study, to push for its recognition, to bring it into the discourse of history. This script has no champion. In the halls of universities, it is rarely mentioned, except as a curiosity. In official reports, it is often omitted, entirely replaced with vague phrases like undecorated ceramics or non-iconographic markings. The contrast is painful to see. Languages like Mayan glyphs and cuneiform were brought back to life through global collaboration, with scholars pooling resources to crack their codes. Here the silence is almost deliberate. Some whisper that acknowledging this script would force an admission of the civilization's existence, and by extension a rewriting of the historical map. Better perhaps to let the symbols remain an unsolved puzzle than to risk the flood of questions they would unleash. But the symbols persist, and so do the efforts of a few outsiders. Independent researchers, often dismissed as fringe by the academic establishment, have begun compiling photographs, making digital tracings, and searching for patterns. Using statistical analysis, they have identified recurring sequences that behave like grammar. Certain signs tend to follow others as verbs, follow subjects or adjectives precede nouns. Others cluster in pairs, suggesting fixed phrases or ceremonial titles. Even without a bilingual, Rosetta Stone progress is being made in mapping the structure of the language. One particularly compelling breakthrough came from comparing the script to ancient calendars. Several inscriptions include a set of 3 repeating symbols at regular intervals. Cross-referenced with astronomical data, these may correspond to lunar cycles, a calendar system embedded in the writing itself. If true, it would mean the civilization not only had a written language, but also a sophisticated understanding of timekeeping. And yet, despite these clues, official recognition remains elusive. Museums rarely display the inscribed artifacts. Dig sites that produce them are often closed abruptly, with the finds sent into storage pending further analysis. Grants for independent study are scarce, and those who push too hard find themselves without institutional support. It is as if the language has been caught in the same erasing hand that wiped the civilization from the maps. But the danger of erasure is that it can never be complete. Every buried tablet, every carved lintel, every pendant with a scratched symbol is a seed waiting for the right moment to sprout. And perhaps the reason no scholar claims this language is the same reason it must be claimed, because to hear the voice of this lost people is to admit they once spoke loudly, clearly, and in a place where history insists they were silent. One day, perhaps the missing key will surface: a bilingual text, a translation preserved in an unexpected archive, a descendant language hiding in plain sight. And when it does, the voice of this civilization will not just whisper from the soil. It will speak in full sentences, telling us not only who they were, but why they were silenced. The written record may have abandoned this civilization, but myths have a way of defying erasure. Long after empires crumble and languages vanish, stories linger, drifting across generations, reshaped in the telling, yet stubbornly refusing to die. And in the case of this lost people, it is in myth, not history, that their shadow survives. Across the mountains, once thought to mark the edge of their world, the elders tell of the people of the Black Stone. In one version, they built walls that sang when the wind passed through them. In another, their cities glowed with a light that came not from fire, but from something deeper in the earth. These tales are not written down. They are told in the quiet after harvest, or by the fire in the long nights of winter. Stories for those who remember that not all truths are safe to speak openly. Far away on a coast, they are not supposed to have reached. Fishermen still sing a song to call in their nets. Its words are in a dialect no one fully understands, but the melody carries the name of a pale king who comes from the mountains and returns there when the sea grows heavy. The same pale king appears in a Highland myth, not as a ruler but as a wanderer carrying the sunstone that guided his people back to safety after the great water rose. The contrast with written history is striking. Official chronicles ignore such figures, dismissing them as archetypes: the wise king, the wandering savior, the builder of impossible walls. Yet, These myths share details too precise to be coincidence. The same number of great rivers in three separate traditions, the same sequence of disasters, drought, quake, flood leading to the people's departure, the same lament sung for those who walked into the western sun. Patterns like this do not emerge from nothing. They suggest either shared origin or sustained contact, both of which contradict the accepted view that these cultures never met. Some of the stories are so vivid they feel like eyewitness accounts. In one valley, the tale speaks of a city of red roofs abandoned in a single day when the shadow from the west arrived. The shadow is never explained. Sometimes it is a cloud, sometimes an army, sometimes the anger of the gods. But in every telling, the city is gone by morning, and the people never return. Folklorists who have studied these narratives note a peculiar phenomenon. The farther one travels from the ruins themselves, the more clearly the myths retain certain core details. Close to the heartland, the stories are fragmented, their details blurred, but hundreds of miles away among people who should have no direct memory of the civilization. The accounts are more structured, almost as if the memory was safer, in exile beyond the reach of whatever force erased it at home. And the myths are not purely local. Sailors' logbooks from centuries ago describe encounters in distant ports where traders claimed descent from the builders of the Singing Walls. In one account, a ship captain is gifted a small carved talisman, a bird with outstretched wings said to be the emblem of the city beneath the mountains. That same bird appears in petroglyphs near the buried cities and in pottery designs excavated thousands of miles away. The contrast here is as sharp as it is telling. Written history presents a clean, uninterrupted narrative of cultural evolution, each civilization rising from the ashes of the last, in a neat progression. Myth, on the other hand, is messy. It preserves overlaps, contradictions, and hints of forgotten connections. Yet in that messiness lies its power. Myths are harder to censor. They travel in memory, in song, in ritual. They cannot be locked away in archives or erased from maps. And so while history insists that this civilization never existed, myth keeps whispering otherwise. In some cases, the myths are not just stories. They are instructions. A few villages still perform an annual rite in which participants carry black stones to the river, wash them, and return them to a shrine. When asked why, the elders say only, "So we remember the ones who showed us the way." The stones are similar in size and polish to the artifacts recovered from the ruins. Artifacts officially labeled as ritual items with no known cultural connection. For archaeologists willing to listen, these oral traditions can be as valuable as any excavation. In one case, a local legend described the gate that opens only in the morning light. Guided by that story, researchers located the remains of a massive stone archway aligned perfectly to catch the sunrise on the summer solstice. Beneath it lay an avenue leading directly to the heart of the buried city. And yet, despite such finds, scholarship rarely integrates myth into the historical record, especially when it threatens to rewrite that record. The myths are filed away as folk culture, their connections to archaeology treated as coincidence. But for those piecing together the fragments, the convergence of story and stone is too consistent to ignore. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these myths is their tone. They do not speak of the lost people with fear or resentment. There are no tales of conquest or enslavement, no warnings of vengeance. Instead, there is mourning, a quiet grief, for something beautiful that was taken away. In the songs, the lost people are remembered, not for war, but for the gifts they brought, seeds for crops, patterns for weaving the art of shaping stone so that it sings in the wind. It is this grief that feels most resistant to time. Empires may erase names and dates, but the feeling of loss that lingers. And in that feeling, perhaps lies the truest record of who these people were. Myth may not give us the precision of a carbon date or the clarity of a map, but it offers something history. Often cannot a glimpse into the human heart of the past. And when the heart speaks louder than the official record, it forces us to ask, which one tells the deeper truth? Trade is one of history's most stubborn records. Empires rise and fall, languages change, cities crumble, but trade leaves traces that are almost impossible to erase. Goods move through the hands of merchants and into the soil of distant lands carried, in the form of pottery metals, dyes, and grains. Even when the name of a people disappears, their wares can speak for them. And in the case of this lost civilization, those wares tell a story as haunting as it is disruptive. The first hint came from an archaeological site far from the civilization's suspected homeland, a bustling ancient port city of a well-documented empire. Among the debris of warehouses and shipyards, researchers found storage jars filled with a distinctive blue dye chemical. Analysis revealed something astonishing. The dye came from a mineral unique to a specific mountain range hundreds of miles inland from the port, a place that, according to official maps, was empty wilderness at the time. This was not a one-off anomaly. In other ports across the region, similar goods appeared metals alloyed in ratios unknown to the cultures who received them. Textiles woven with patterns and dyes unmatched by any known loom-carved ornaments whose stone sources could be pinpointed, to the same uninhabited region. The goods appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, spread quickly across multiple trade hubs, and then vanished just as suddenly as if a switch had been flipped. The contrast with normal trade patterns is striking. When a commodity disappears from history, it usually does so gradually. The source dries up, prices rise cheaper, substitutes appear, and eventually demand fades. But here the goods vanish in a single layer of the archaeological strata, one season. They are abundant. The next, they are gone entirely. This kind of abrupt disappearance is almost unheard of in peacetime commerce. It speaks of something catastrophic, a supply network severed, a trading culture extinguished. Some of these goods were more than luxuries. Agricultural analysis has shown that certain grain varieties found in distant storage pits are genetically identical to strains still growing wild in the lost civilization's suspected homeland. This implies an active agricultural export, one that could not simply be replaced if the source disappeared. Such a sudden cutoff would have rippled across the economies of their trading partners, disrupting not just wealth, but survival. Yet curiously, those disruptions leave little. Trace in official records, we would expect to find lamentations in merchants, ledgers, complaints in governors' reports, price fluctuations in city archives. Instead, there is nothing. The historical silence is as total in the trading partners' documents as it is in the homelands. Ports that once bustled with exchange are described in later records as always quiet, as if the decades of flourishing commerce never happened. This coordinated absence raises disturbing questions. How could multiple cultures, often rivals or outright enemies, all choose to erase the same commercial relationships? What possible threat could this lost civilization's memory pose to warrant such deliberate amnesia? And why, if they were only traders, would their destruction or disappearance require the suppression of even their economic history? The answer may lie in the sophistication of the goods themselves. Metallurgical studies have shown that the lost civilization's metalwork employed alloying techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. These were not accidental mixtures from smelting ores. They were deliberate, repeatable formulas, some of which produce metal with properties modern engineers find remarkable jewelry set with gemstones had been. Cut and polished with methods thought impossible before the arrival of iron tools. Textiles incorporated weaving patterns so complex that reproducing them on modern looms requires skilled programming. Such advancements imply a knowledge base that might have been seen as dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands, if their metallurgy could outclass neighboring armies' weapons, if their engineering could outbuild rival cities, if their agricultural exports could sustain populations far from their homeland, then their destruction might have been as much about control as conquest. Erasing their existence would ensure their innovations could be absorbed without credit or without challenge. We see hints of this absorption in the decades. After their disappearance, techniques and styles that appear suddenly in neighboring cultures, ship designs, irrigation methods, artistic motifs, bear uncanny similarities to those in the lost civilization's surviving artifacts. Yet, in the official narrative, these innovations are presented as local inventions arising independently. The economic influence of their origin is buried, replaced with convenient myths of spontaneous development. One of the most telling examples comes from a series of maritime logs kept by a coastal kingdom several hundred miles away. For about 50 years, the logs record annual visits from the mountain ships, large vessels with distinctive double prows, carrying goods from inland via a vast river system. Then, abruptly, the entries stop. The year after the last recorded visit, the logs switch to describing trade with new inland merchants whose goods are similar but fewer in number and of lower quality. No explanation is offered. The phrase mountain ships never appears again. Further inland, the economic trail emerges in the form of weights and measures. Archaeologists have found standardized trade weights, uniform stone cubes carved to exact dimensions in multiple markets, far from the civilization's homeland. Their sizes correspond to no known local system, but match perfectly with sets recovered from the ruins themselves. This suggests a far-reaching trade network governed by a shared economic language, one that collapsed overnight. The abruptness of that collapse leaves archaeologists and historians with a dilemma. If it was caused by natural disaster, flood, earthquake, drought, we would expect at least some goods to trickle through the network in the aftermath. Traders from neighboring cultures could have salvaged stockpiles, resold goods, or established new supply lines. But here, the cutoff is absolute. Not only do the goods vanish, but the demand for them seems to evaporate, as if the very idea of their existence was erased along with the source. And yet the soil remembers. In the markets of certain ruined cities, excavations have revealed discarded goods, chipped jewelry, broken tools, fragments of dyed cloth left behind when stalls were abandoned. These remnants frozen in place for millennia are snapshots of a moment when trade was still alive, the goods still valued. The next layer of soil above them is empty of such artifacts, a silent marker of the day the caravans and ships stopped coming. In modern terms, we might think of this as an economic blackout, a sudden removal of a major player from the global market. The ripple effects would have been profound, destabilizing allies and enemies alike, and yet those ripples leave no official mark in the annals of history. Only the goods themselves dug from the ground centuries later tell us that such a player ever existed. Trade may be stubborn, but even it can be silenced not by the passing of time, but by the will of those who decide which stories are told. And so the vanished goods of this lost civilization become more than economic relics. They are evidence of a deliberate act, not just the destruction of a people, but the removal of their role in the shared life of the ancient world. Their ships no longer sail. Their caravans no longer cross the desert. Their harbors are silted, their markets overgrown, and yet in the hands of archaeologists, a shard of pottery dyed blue or a bead carved from a stone found only in their mountains becomes a message across time: we were here, we traded, and someone decided you should forget. Every great archaeological discovery begins with a journey, but some journeys never make it into the history books. The story of this lost civilization is littered with expeditions that promised revelations only to vanish into silence. Sometimes, the silence was the result of danger in the field. Other times it was far stranger the kind of silence that follows when someone decides the results should never be known. The first recorded forbidden expedition dates to the late 18th century. A European naturalist traveling under royal patronage reported hearing of strange ruins, deep inland stone walls taller than any cathedral, carved with symbols no one in the surrounding villages could read. His letters sent back to his sponsors described grand plans for a full-scale survey. Then, without warning, the correspondence stopped. Months later, his ship returned to port without him. The crew claimed he had succumbed to fever and that his papers had been lost during a river crossing. No one ever recovered his notes. The pattern repeated in the 19th century during the fever of imperial exploration. An American geographer led an expedition up a river that maps of the time barely acknowledged, funded quietly by a wealthy industrialist. The team was said to be searching for mineral deposits. Weeks later they returned, but their journals were confiscated by local authorities before they could leave the port. Members of the team gave conflicting accounts. Some spoke of stone avenues. Running into the jungle, others denied finding anything at all. Within a year, nearly all of them had taken posts far from the region, and none ever published a report. Not all expeditions ended in complete secrecy. Some trickled out fragments of information before the curtain fell. In the 1920s, a French archaeological team photographed what they called a city of pillars in a remote valley. The photos showed towering columns lined in precise rows, their capitals carved in the shapes of animals, unknown to the local fauna. The images were published in a small academic journal, sparking brief excitement. Then, inexplicably, the next issue of the journal contained a formal retraction. The photographs were misinterpreted, the structures natural, rock formations. The negatives were never seen again. The contrast with legitimate sanctioned archaeology is stark. When ruins are discovered that fit the accepted narrative, expeditions are celebrated, findings, published artifacts displayed in museums. But when the discovery threatens to contradict the official history, the tone changes. Funding disappears. Permits are revoked. Reports are delayed until the public has forgotten the initial excitement. It is a pattern seen again and again in the search for this lost civilization. In the 1960s, a university survey team used aerial photography to scan a river basin believed to have been part of the civilization's trade network. They reported rectilinear anomalies, straight lines, and right angles visible beneath the forest canopy, impossible to form naturally on that scale. Before they could mount a ground expedition, the project was suddenly classified under environmental protection, and no further access was granted. A member of the team speaking decades later hinted that the photographs showed more than just lines. They revealed an entire city grid. In more recent years, technology has made it harder to hide what's there. Satellite imagery and LiDAR scans, tools capable of peeling away vegetation to reveal structures below, have confirmed the presence of vast organized settlements where no ancient habitation was supposed to exist. Independent researchers have published some of these findings online, but the raw data often disappears shortly afterward, flagged for copyright concerns or data misuse. In some cases, the satellite images are quietly replaced with updated versions in which the anomalies are blurred or obscured by digital artifacts. The suppression isn't always direct. Sometimes it comes in the form of logistical sabotage, fuel shortages that prevent expeditions from leaving port, lost shipments of equipment, bureaucratic delays in customs. Veteran explorers know the signs, the subtle message that while no one is forbidding the journey outright, someone wants it to fail before it starts. One of the most infamous cases occurred just a decade ago. A private-funded team led by a respected archaeologist announced plans to excavate a site, identified through LiDAR as a massive ceremonial complex. Just days before departure, local authorities declared the entire region a restricted zone due to unexploded ordnance left from an old conflict. The restriction has never been lifted. The Archaeologist now retired has stated publicly that she believes the ordnance explanation was a pretext, that the true reason for the shutdown was to keep whatever lay beneath the soil from being uncovered. The contrast between the stories of these expeditions and those celebrated in the media is not merely about access, it's about control. Official archaeology is a gatekeeper of narrative. If a discovery reinforces the current timeline, it is welcomed, even exaggerated. If it threatens to rewrite that timeline, it is quietly buried sometimes, literally. It is tempting to imagine a shadowy conspiracy, a single hand directing all these erasures. The truth is likely messier, a web of political interests, academic gatekeeping, and economic pressures that together create an environment where certain discoveries are too inconvenient to acknowledge. A lost civilization with advanced technology, wide trade influence, and a mysterious disappearance would destabilize not just history books, but the pride of nations built on claims of firstness. And yet, despite the suppression, the expeditions keep coming. Every decade or so, another team sets out, drawn by rumors of stone streets swallowed by forest or of artifacts found in riverbeds after floods. Some return empty-handed. Others return with whispers about glyphs on walls, about vaults filled with sealed jars, about statues carved in faces no one can match to any living people. The most remarkable thing is not that so many expeditions have been stopped. It's that in spite of every barrier, enough evidence has leaked through to prove that the stories are true. The ruins are there. The artifacts are real. The civilization existed. What remains hidden for now is the full picture. The maps that would connect the sites, the artifacts that would confirm the trade routes, the inscriptions that would reveal the names of rulers and cities. They may still lie in crates in basements, in private collections, or deep in the soil where no shovel has yet reached. But history has a way of resurfacing, and one day one of these forbidden expeditions may succeed in breaking through the wall of silence, and the world will have to reckon with what it finds. Ruins can be buried, artifacts hidden, expeditions stopped. But written records, if they survive, are a different kind of danger to those who want history controlled. They cannot be explained away as natural formations or trade curiosities. A line of ink naming a city, a treaty referencing a ruler, a tax record listing goods, these are undeniable proof. Which may be why, when it comes to this lost civilization, the archives themselves seem to have been swept clean. Researchers who have sought documentary evidence face a strangely consistent problem wherever they search. There is nothing to find. National archives in countries that now occupy the civilization's suspected homeland have extensive collections covering even the most obscure aspects of ancient governance. They have tax ledgers for tiny villages, weather reports for forgotten seasons, ship manifests for ports that handled only a handful of vessels a year. But for the region in question, for the centuries in which the lost civilization is believed to have thrived, there is nothing, not a single direct reference. The contrast with surrounding regions is startling. In neighboring kingdoms, records flow unbroken lines of kings, harvest tallies, accounts of wars, both won and lost. And yet in documents where one might expect mention of border disputes or trade relations, there is only blankness. Sometimes the gap is masked with vague phrases like lands beyond the hills or the Western merchants, but never a name. Never a clear identifier. Some archivists quietly admit that the gap is not a matter of absence, but of access. Certain files are marked as restricted, their catalog entries vague or deliberately misleading. A researcher might find a reference to coastal survey year 342, only to discover that the folder contains unrelated agricultural reports. In other cases, requested documents are said to be under restoration for decades, at a time conveniently unavailable for study. In the late 19th century, a historian, claimed to have seen a parchment treaty between a known coastal empire and the mountain realm. The treaty listed terms of maritime passage, the exchange of goods, and a clause pledging mutual defense. The historian copied the text by hand, intending to publish it. Weeks later, the original document was declared lost in a recataloguing error, and his copy was dismissed as a forgery. He died before he could defend its authenticity. The story is not unique. In the 1930s, a scholar researching ancient river navigation rights stumbled upon a set of scrolls in a provincial archive. The scrolls, she said, described tolls levied on foreign caravans entering a walled city on the edge of the desert. The city's name matched nothing in official histories, but its description matched the location of a known ruin tied to the lost civilization. Within a month, the scrolls were removed from the archive, and the scholar was told they had been relocated to the capital. They were never seen again. Sometimes, the silence is more subtle omissions in otherwise exhaustive records. A palace archive might contain every royal edict for a century, except those from the reign of a king known to have launched military campaigns toward the lost civilization's territory. In one particularly strange case, a maritime logbook contained page after page of weather reports and navigational notes, but entire weeks were missing from a voyage that, according to the ship's route, would have brought it within sight of the lost civilization's coastal settlements. The deliberate nature of these gaps becomes clear when one compares parallel archives. Merchants in one region might mention shipments of Blackstone vessels without naming their origin. A neighboring kingdom's customs records might list the exact same shipment, but attribute it to unknown inland traders. The goods are the same. The names are erased. It is tempting to believe these erasures were the result of a single purge, some great rewriting of the record after the civilization's fall. But the pattern suggests otherwise. The gaps span centuries, as if each generation of record keepers understood that certain entries should not be made. Whether by decree, tradition, or fear, the silence was maintained. Some have tried to circumvent the gatekeepers by searching private collections. Wealthy families, monasteries, and old merchant houses sometimes hold their own archives passed down outside the control of the state. In rare cases, these collections yield treasures, a merchant's ledger noting tribute paid to the city of pillars, or a letter describing a royal wedding between a foreign princess and a prince from the mountains beyond the clouds. Such references are fleeting often, buried in unrelated documents, and their authenticity is difficult to prove without the official context. Yet they are enough to suggest that the name of this civilization was once spoken openly before it became forbidden. The contrast between public and private records is telling. Public archives are clean, orderly, and empty of the civilization's presence. Private archives are messy, inconsistent, and full of whispers. In the official halls, the past is curated to fit the narrative. In attics and storerooms, fragments of the truth survive by accident. Even more intriguing are the sealed archives collections known to exist, but closed to all but a select few. Some are restricted for reasons of national security, even though their contents are centuries old. Others are tied to religious institutions where access is limited to high-ranking members. Rumors persist of entire rooms filled with maps, treaties, and genealogies that, if made public, would force a radical revision of history. Whether these rumors are true or not, the mere fact that such restrictions exist fuels suspicion. Modern technology has begun to erode some of these walls. Digitization projects, often run by universities or international organizations occasionally, bring hidden material into the open. A scanned page here, a misfiled photograph there. But the release of such material is unpredictable, and when it touches on the lost civilization, it has a strange habit of disappearing again. Researchers speak of online archives, where one day a document is available for download and the next the link is dead. The silence of the archives is more than an absence. It is a presence in its own right, a shape defined by what it withholds. To walk through the stacks and see centuries of history perfectly preserved on either side of a yawning gap is to feel the weight of deliberate forgetting. It is to know that somewhere behind a locked door or in a mislabeled box, the missing pages still exist, and so the search continues in dusty storerooms, in whispered conversations with archivists willing to bend the rules in the hope that a single sheet of parchment might survive the long conspiracy of silence. Because if that sheet ever surfaces naming the lost civilization outright, it will be harder to hide than any ruin, harder to dismiss than any artifact. It will be the moment when history itself speaks and refuses to be quieted again. History is not only shaped by what is remembered, it is shaped just as powerfully by what is forgotten. The missing maps, the sealed archives, the vanished trade goods, the silenced expeditions taken alone, each could be explained away as misfortune, neglect, or coincidence. But together they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. They suggest not an accident of history, but an intention. A decision made at some point in the past to remove this civilization from the human story. The image that emerges is not of a single dramatic purge, a one-time burning of records, but of a quieter, longer campaign, a conspiracy of dust. Dust to bury the streets and temples, dust to obscure the names in archives, dust to settle over the lips of those who might remember. The result is an absence so complete that even questioning it feels like heresy. The contrast with other lost civilizations is stark. When Troy was abandoned, its ruins remained in plain sight, whispered about in legend, until they were found again. When the Maya cities were swallowed by jungle, their stone temples still stood their glyphs, waiting to be read. Here it is not just the physical traces that have been hidden. It is the very idea of the civilization that has been removed. The erasure is not passive. It is surgical. Who would do such a thing? And why? The possible motives fall into three broad categories: political, religious, and economic. Politically, a powerful neighbor might have wished to erase a rival's legacy, claiming their innovations and territory as their own. If this civilization had once dominated the region, militarily, technologically, or culturally, then obliterating their name from history would serve to consolidate the victor's claim without. Records future generations would never know there had been another center of power. Religiously, their beliefs may have clashed with the dominant faiths of later empires. If their temples housed rituals or philosophies deemed heretical, their destruction might have been framed as divine justice. The suppression of their memory would then become an act of spiritual purification, not merely erasing their political influence, but their very worldview. Economically, the civilization's destruction may have been about control of resources. If they monopolized valuable trade goods or possessed technologies others wished to keep exclusive, erasing them would eliminate both competition and the danger of those innovations spreading. The victors could absorb their techniques while ensuring no one else could challenge their claim to invention. What is most disturbing is that these motives are not mutually exclusive. A coalition of powers, political, religious, and economic, could have found common cause in erasing the civilization entirely, and once begun, the machinery of forgetting can sustain itself. Each generation grows up without the memory, making it easier to justify the silence. Eventually, the erasure becomes so deep that even the erasers themselves forget what they destroyed. There is also the question of how this could be coordinated across so many centuries and cultures. Here, the answer may lie in influence rather than direct control. Powerful empires set the tone for what is worth recording. Their scribes, their historians, their cartographers all work within frameworks defined by authority. If the ruling power of an era declared that nothing lies beyond the mountains, then every map and chronicle would repeat. That claim whether from loyalty, fear, or simple habit. In time, the repetition becomes reality. Some historians are wary of calling this a conspiracy at all. They point out that much of human history is simply lost to time, washed away by floods burned. In wars forgotten, as languages die, they argue that we risk over-interpreting coincidence. But this argument falters when faced with the consistency of the gaps. Natural loss scatters randomly. This loss is selective. Whole centuries are preserved, in exhaustive detail except where this civilization should appear. It is in the margins where the erasure shows its hand. A ledger in one city lists trade with the Western merchants, while a similar ledger in another city names every other trading partner in full except them. A chronicle mentions a war against a people whose name we are forbidden to write. A temple relief shows a procession of dignitaries, each labeled in carved text, except for one whose inscription has been chiseled out. This is the fingerprint of deliberate forgetting, an edit, not an accident. And yet even the most thorough campaign cannot remove everything. Fragments survive in private collections, in the oral traditions of remote communities, in the soil beneath. Forgotten hills. These scraps are too scattered to threaten the official narrative unless someone connects them. That is the danger for those who would keep the past buried, the moment the fragments align. The erased civilization reemerges, and the dust begins to clear. What remains unknown is whether the erasure began in the civilization's own time as an immediate act of destruction, or whether it was completed long after their fall when their ruins were already fading. Perhaps they were, first weakened by disaster, war, or migration, and only later did others decide to finish the work by removing them from memory. Or perhaps the campaign began while they still stood a war not just of armies, but of ideas, the writing of their name, into the dust before the city gates had even fallen. If that is the case, then they were not simply forgotten. They were silenced while their voices were still echoing. And that means somewhere in the overlapping shadows of politics, faith, and commerce, we might still find the fingerprints of those who wielded the eraser. The ruins that remain are silent now, but they were not always so. Once these streets echoed with voices, merchants calling out their wares, children chasing one another between the market stalls, the rhythmic clang of a smith's hammer ringing through the warm air. The term ghost city conjures images of emptiness, but here the ghosts are not merely the absence of people, they are the impressions left behind, the shapes of lives that for reasons we still struggle to understand were erased. Archaeology allows us to reconstruct some of those lives. The layout of the cities is telling they were planned, not grown haphazardly over centuries. Streets followed a precise grid with drainage channels running alongside them, an innovation that would not appear in many other regions for centuries. At the heart of each city lay a central plaza, a space both civic and ceremonial. Around it rose the largest structures, temples, administrative halls, and perhaps even public theaters. From this center roads radiated outward to residential quarters, workshops, and gardens. The contrast with contemporary settlements is striking. Where other cities of the same era sprawled organically adapting to terrain and necessity, these cities seem to have been conceived. Whole designed for efficiency, order, and perhaps even beauty-building foundations suggest uniform dimensions, yet decorative flourishes vary from house to house, carved door lintels with geometric patterns, painted walls in deep reds and ochres, tiled courtyards that caught the light. This was a culture that valued both harmony and individual expression. Inside the home's artifacts speak of lives neither primitive nor impoverished. Clay ovens were built into kitchen areas, some still containing the charred remains of grain and seeds. Storage jars stood in recessed shelves, their lids designed to keep pests out. In wealthier districts, fragments of finely woven cloth hint at a textile tradition of remarkable skill, while simple homes display sturdy, well-made pottery, functional yet often decorated with repeating motifs that may have held symbolic meaning. Workshops reveal a society of specialists. In one quarter, the remains of a metalworker's forge hold slag from advanced alloy production, including traces of tin and arsenic in combinations suggesting deliberate experimentation. In another, potter's wheels lie where they fell, surrounded by shards of both utilitarian and ceremonial vessels. There are rooms filled with grinding stones, and woven baskets suggesting flour production on a scale that implies centralized food distribution, perhaps a form of social organization designed to prevent famine. The streets themselves were more than thoroughfares. Many are flanked by low, stone benches as if designed for rest, conversation, or trade. In some areas, covered walkways suggest a concern for shelter during extreme weather. Drainage channels, still partially intact, show evidence of complex maintenance systems. Removable stone covers sediment traps and branching canals to divert water toward fields outside the city walls. And there were walls, not crude fortifications, but carefully engineered barriers that blended defense with civic pride. Some are adorned with relief, carvings, animals, abstract designs, and what appear to be stylized depictions of processions. These may have been civic celebrations, religious rituals, or commemorations of events now lost to us. What strikes the modern observer most, however, is the absence of clear social segregation. While some districts are richer in artifacts than others, the cities do not display the stark divisions seen in many ancient urban centers. The homes of artisans, farmers, and administrators are often within walking distance of one another. Markets are centrally located, and public spaces are accessible from all quarters. Whether this reflects a more egalitarian society or simply a different approach to urban planning is unclear, but it sets these ghost cities apart from many of their contemporaries. The evidence of leisure is equally intriguing. Excavations have revealed gaming boards carved into stone steps, small clay figurines that may have been toys and musical instruments, flutes made from bone, drums from stretched animal hide. Such finds suggest a culture that valued entertainment, artistry, and play as part of daily life. Religion, too, left its mark. Temple complexes, though partially collapsed, still bear traces of elaborate stonework and pigment. Some feature altars aligned to solar and lunar events, suggesting a deep knowledge of astronomy. Offerings found buried beneath floors, shells, beads, carved stones indicate ritual practices meant to bind the living to the divine. Yet there is no evidence of the kind of monumental idol worship seen in some neighboring civilizations. The art here feels more symbolic, abstract, and perhaps more personal. The contrast between the vibrancy of these reconstructed lives and the silence that followed is jarring. There is no archaeological record of siege or mass slaughter, no layer of ash or charred timber to mark destruction by fire. The ghost cities do not speak of sudden catastrophe so much as deliberate abandonment. Streets were left to silt over canals, clogged walls crumbled from neglect rather than assault. It is as though one day the people simply walked away. Why they did so remains a mystery. Climate change could have played a role. Pollen analysis from surrounding fields suggests periods of drought. Yet the irrigation systems here were robust, designed to handle fluctuating water levels. Disease is another possibility, but if plague had swept the cities, it left no mass graves. War cannot be ruled out, but the absence of battle damage argues against a prolonged siege, which brings us back to the possibility raised in earlier sections that the abandonment was neither voluntary nor the result of a single disaster, but part of a larger campaign to remove these people from both land and memory. A forced relocation, perhaps, or a coordinated dismantling of their urban centers. The psychological effect of standing in one of these ghost cities is profound. You can walk the length of a street past houses whose thresholds are still worn by centuries of footsteps and hear nothing but wind. You can stand in the central plaza, where voices once gathered, and feel the weight of the space pressing in, as if the air remembers the absence. Archaeology can rebuild the walls, trace the drainage systems, catalog the pottery, but it cannot bring back the sound of life. That silence is the truest ghost of all. Yet the cities endure in another way. They are stubborn, even buried they resist complete obliteration. A farmer's plow will strike a wall. A heavy rain will uncover a carved stone. A landslide will reveal a staircase cut into the earth. And every time the city resurfaces even briefly, it disrupts the neat official version of history. Every rediscovery is a reminder that the erasure was never perfect. The ghost cities, in their quiet way, are the best argument against the conspiracy of dust. They show us that no matter how much is buried under soil, under lies, under deliberate forgetting some, truths will always find their way back into the light. The ruins of the ghost cities already disrupt the neat narrative of history, but the real shock lies in the objects recovered from them. They are not just the remains of daily life, they are artifacts that, by the standards of the accepted timeline, should not exist. They suggest a mastery of science and engineering centuries, even millennia ahead of their supposed era. One such discovery came from a collapsed workshop near the edge of a city's industrial quarter. Inside, archaeologists found rows of copper and bronze tools, nothing unusual, until metallurgical analysis revealed that some were alloyed with trace elements in precise ratios, known today to improve hardness and corrosion resistance. These ratios were not random. They were exact, repeatable, and matched across tools from multiple sites. Modern engineers immediately recognized the compositions as deliberate formulas, the kind still taught in metallurgy courses today. In the official view, such control over alloying should not have been possible until much later civilizations. The contrast with contemporary cultures is striking. In neighboring regions, metalworking of the same period was still dominated by trial and error with inconsistent results. Here, the lost civilization seems to have been working from established principles, as though they understood the underlying science, not just the craft. Pottery offers another unsettling example. Among the thousands of shards unearthed, some carry glazes fired at temperatures far exceeding what local kilns of the time could produce. Modern testing shows that these glazes were vitrified, turned to glass through controlled heat treatment that would have required advanced kiln design. And yet no surviving kilns have been found that match this capability, leading to speculation that the technology itself was destroyed or dismantled when the cities were abandoned. Perhaps most baffling are the stoneworks. Blocks weighing several tons are cut with a precision that defies the crude tools historians assign to the period. Some fit together so perfectly that even modern laser measurement struggles to detect the seams. Microscopic analysis of the surfaces shows striations consistent with techniques that remove material layer by layer, not the rough chiseling of hammer and wedge. While some suggest advanced forms of abrasion or polishing, others point to methods we do not yet fully understand. This precision is not confined to monumental architecture every day. Objects, too, reveal unexpected sophistication. A set of bone flutes, for example, is tuned to a scale that matches modern Western intervals, an odd coincidence given the wide variety of tuning systems in the ancient world. Their holes are placed with such accuracy that even a millimeter's deviation would alter the pitch, suggesting the makers possessed measuring tools far more refined than the crude cord and stick systems attributed to the era. Even more puzzling are the so-called starstones, flat disc-shaped carvings found in temple ruins engraved with radiating lines and clusters of dots. At first assumed to be decorative, detailed mapping has shown that some match the positions of constellations as they would have appeared thousands of years ago, long before their supposed construction. The accuracy of these celestial maps implies a deep understanding of astronomy, including the slow drift of the stars caused by axial precession, a phenomenon not officially recorded until ancient Greece. The contrast with accepted technological timelines is glaring. In standard history, knowledge advances incrementally. Discoveries build upon previous ones, slowly spreading through contact and trade. But the artifacts of this civilization feel like leaps, not steps. They appear fully formed, as though they had been inherited from an even earlier tradition rather than invented in isolation. Some researchers suggest that these leaps could be explained by lost trade connections, that the technologies were imported from elsewhere, their origins forgotten. But this theory falters when faced with the sheer breadth of innovation. Metallurgy, ceramics, architecture, astronomy, and music all show evidence of advancement to borrow so many. Disciplines from so many different sources would require a level of global connectivity that we do not see in the historical record. Then there are the objects that resist classification altogether. In one sealed chamber beneath a collapsed administrative. Building archaeologists found a set of small stone cylinders, each incised with complex spiral patterns. When rolled across clay, these patterns form intricate interlocking designs, but unlike known seal stones used for marking ownership, these seem to create repeating sequences with no clear symbolic meaning. Some mathematicians who have studied the patterns suggest they may encode numerical data or serve as templates for mechanical components. If so, they would represent a kind of applied mathematics far beyond what is documented for the time. The official response to such finds is predictable reclassification, downplaying, or quiet storage. A precision-cut stone block is labeled ritual object. A high-temperature glaze is called accidental. Overfiring and astronomical engravings are dismissed as coincidental resemblance, but the accumulation of anomalies makes coincidence an increasingly fragile explanation. The reluctance to acknowledge these advancements is understandable to admit. Them would force a revision of everything we think we know about technological development. It would challenge the assumption that complexity always comes late, and that earlier societies must be simpler than those that follow. It would also raise uncomfortable questions. If this civilization had such knowledge, why did it disappear? And if it was erased, was it because of that knowledge? There is another possibility, one that is harder to confront. Perhaps the science of this civilization did not vanish entirely. Perhaps it was taken. If conquerors dismantled their cities, they may have carried away not only goods and slaves, but also engineers, artisans, and scholars. The knowledge could have been absorbed into other cultures stripped of its origin and passed off as their own. In this way, the civilization's advancements would survive, but their name would not. Whether stolen, suppressed, or simply lost the science that should not exist, remains the most dangerous evidence against the official narrative. It is tangible, measurable, and resistant to dismissal. A ruin can be called a natural formation. A map can be called a mistake, but an alloy with a precise intentional composition is proof of a mind that knew what it was doing. And that is the truth that lingers in every shard, every carved line, every perfect join in stone. Someone long before they were supposed to master knowledge we only rediscovered centuries later, and someone else decided the world should forget. Every civilization tells its story, not just in words but in faces. We carve them into stone, paint them onto walls, cast them in metal, shape them in clay, portraits, statues, reliefs. They are how a culture declares, "This is who we are, yet for this." Lost civilization. Those faces are strangely absent. In the ruins of their cities, the art survives, but it is art that seems to avoid looking directly at us. The first hints came from fragmented statuary archaeologists, uncovered torso after torso, figures clothed in elaborate garments adorned with jewelry frozen mid-gesture, but heads missing. Sometimes the break was jagged, the result of collapse. More often, it was deliberate chisel marks, cleanly separating neck from shoulders as though Someone had gone through the city, removing every face they could find. The same pattern appears in wall reliefs. Scenes of processions, feasts, and rituals are intact in every detail, except one. The faces have been gouged away. The tools used were sharp the work, efficient, suggesting it was done by skilled hands, not random looters. This is the mark of iconoclasm, the targeted destruction of identity. The contrast with neighboring cultures is telling. Elsewhere, conquerors often recarved faces into the likeness of their own rulers or inscribed victory scenes over the defeated. But here no replacement images were added. It was not an overwriting, but an erasure. Whoever did this wanted the identity itself gone, not replaced. And yet a few faces survive. In a collapsed temple chamber spared from later disturbance, excavators found a set of small clay figurines wrapped in woven cloth. Their features are worn but visible. High cheekbones, deep-set eyes, straight noses, hair pulled back into intricate braids. Each figure is unique, yet they share enough traits to suggest a distinct ethnic profile, one not clearly matching any known population in the region today. In another site, buried under layers of collapsed masonry, a carved stele depicts a ruler seated on a throne. The face is intact, perhaps protected by the stone's hardness or by the rubble that fell over it. The ruler wears a headdress shaped like a bird in flight, and his gaze is fixed forward, calm and unyielding around. The figure are smaller attendants, their faces turned in profile showing similar features to the figurines. The style is unlike anything in contemporary art of the region, naturalistic yet stylized, formal yet deeply human. The human remains tell. A parallel story. Skeletal analysis of burials within the cities reveals a population with notable physical variation, suggesting a diverse society, perhaps drawing from multiple regions through trade migration or conquest. Yet certain traits recur. Consistently cranial shapes with slightly elongated skulls achieved naturally, not through binding robust jawlines and dental patterns, distinct from nearby groups. DNA analysis where possible adds more intrigue. In a few well-preserved samples, genetic markers have been found that do not align neatly with the surrounding populations, instead showing connections to distant regions far beyond the expected trade radius. This suggests the civilization may have been a meeting point or melting pot for peoples from across a vast area. The contrast between the physical evidence and the historical silence is jarring. These people were real, distinct, and connected to a wider world, yet every attempt seems to have been made to remove their likeness from history. Why erasing faces is more than vandalism. It is an attack on memory. Without images, future generations cannot easily picture who the lost ones were. Without that picture, it becomes easier to deny they ever existed. Some scholars speculate that the erasure was meant to prevent the dead from looking back, a ritual belief in some cultures that images can anchor a spirit in the world. Others see it as political, destroying the faces of leaders to dismantle the legitimacy of their dynasty. Still others suggest a more calculated motive to obscure any link between this civilization and surviving peoples, cutting off potential claims of heritage or descent. There is also the possibility that some faces were deliberately hidden, not destroyed. A small number of finely carved heads detached from their bodies have turned up in private collections. Their provenance is murky, their discovery often unreported until they appear at auction. Some display features identical to those in the surviving temple stele, suggesting they were once part of larger statues in public spaces. Were these taken as trophies by conquerors or hidden away by those trying to save them from destruction? The art that remains, though faceless still, speaks. Clothing details reveal complex weaving patterns, layered fabrics, and ornamentation with beads and metal fittings. Jewelry styles vary between sites, hinting at regional identities within the civilization. The postures and gestures of the figures suggest a culture of formalized ceremony with specific roles and hierarchies, though the absence of inscriptions leaves their meaning opaque. Perhaps the most haunting discovery is a mural fragment from the inner wall of a collapsed hall. Unlike most public art, this piece is intimate, a domestic scene of two figures seated on the floor sharing food. The faces are gone, but the hands are clasped, the bowls between them painted in vivid color. It is a reminder that behind the politics, the trade, the architecture there were individuals, people with lives and relationships that mattered enough to depict. The vanished faces force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Erasure works best when it removes not just the name of a people, but their image. Without a face, the human connection weakens. They become abstract, a mystery, a concept, a curiosity. To restore the faces is to restore that connection, to make them impossible to dismiss. And so even the smallest surviving likeness, a chipped figurine, a weathered carving, becomes invaluable. Each is a window into who they were, and each is a challenge to the silence that was imposed upon them. Together they remind us that these were not shadows, but people who looked out at their world, and perhaps once looked toward ours. Every disappearance demands an answer. When we stand in the empty streets of the ghost cities, when we see the severed faces and the sealed archives, we cannot help but ask what happened here. Was it the impartial force of nature that ended them, or the deliberate hand of humanity? Or was it something far more complicated, a combination of both? The natural disaster theory is the oldest explanation. Geological surveys show that the region sits on fault lines with a history of earthquakes that could have leveled entire districts. Some layers of rubble bear signs of seismic collapse, tilted walls, cracked foundations, shifted paving stones. Landslide debris in certain valleys suggests sudden and violent ground movement. In one coastal site, sediment layers indicate a massive tsunami swept inland, depositing marine shells deep in the urban core. Climate evidence tells its own story. Pollen analysis from ancient fields shows abrupt transitions from diverse crops to drought-tolerant grain, suggesting extended dry periods. Ice core data from distant glaciers hints at volcanic eruptions around the same era, possibly triggering volcanic winters. Years of reduced sunlight and poor harvests. Flood deposits in river valleys indicate that heavy rains, when they came, were catastrophic, washing away infrastructure and silting harbors. The contrast between these environmental upheavals and the civilization's achievements is telling. They were not passive victims of their landscape. Their canals, floodgates, and elevated roads suggest they anticipated environmental challenges and built to withstand them. This was a society accustomed to adapting, which means that for nature to have destroyed them outright, it would have taken an event or series of events of extraordinary magnitude. Yet even such events do not fully explain the erasure. Natural disasters leave scars, but they rarely remove a people's memory from history. The eruption of Vesuvius buried Pompeii, but Roman records still mention it. Floods, droughts, and quakes have ended cities, but their survivors usually tell the tale. In this case, the silence is too total, the absence feels engineered, that leads us to the human intervention theory, the possibility that they were destroyed by war, conquest, or political suppression. Some archaeological sites show evidence of deliberate dismantling walls toppled systematically, not randomly building stones carted away inscriptions chiseled out. In one ruin, a layer of burned debris contains not household goods, but administrative tablets, as if the invaders targeted the bureaucracy. First erasing the machinery of governance before the physical city, weapon fragments recovered from a rural site hint at military conflict. The style of the blades matches those used by a known regional power centuries later, suggesting either continuity of arms or the repurposing of an earlier design. There are also graves containing multiple skeletons with trauma. Injuries consistent with battle buried in haste without the ceremonial care seen in other burials. Still, a purely military explanation has gaps. If the civilization was conquered, why remove all record of it? Conquerors often celebrate their victories in stone, using the memory of the defeated to glorify themselves. Erasing an enemy's name entirely suggests a deeper motive, not just victory, but obliteration. One hybrid theory bridges these worlds: disaster followed by opportunism. A massive earthquake or prolonged drought could have weakened the civilization, making them vulnerable. Rivals or enemies might have seized the chance to invade, dismantling their cities and dispersing the survivors. In this view, nature delivered the first blow and human hands delivered the second and the final strike. There's another possibility, one that's harder to prove but fits the pattern of erasure-forced assimilation. Rather than killing or driving the population away, conquerors might have absorbed them, scattering communities, outlawing their language, banning their rituals, and physically dismantling their monuments. Over generations, the people would vanish into the dominant culture, leaving behind only fragments of their former identity. The erasure of names, faces, and records would then be part of an intentional program of cultural destruction, one that succeeded so completely that the civilization became invisible. The contrast with other assimilations in history is striking. Rome absorbed dozens of cultures, yet their names survive in the record. Conquered peoples often retain echoes of their heritage in place, names, dialects, or architecture. Here nothing of the kind remains, at least not openly. It suggests that whoever oversaw the assimilation wanted not a blending of cultures, but a total overwrite. There is one final, more speculative thread, the idea that the civilization removed itself. Some oral traditions hint at an exodus, a decision to leave their cities behind and journey elsewhere. This could have been driven by prophecy, environmental collapse, or political schism. In this scenario, the abandonment would not be the result of defeat, but of a deliberate migration, perhaps to escape a threat we do not yet understand. If so, their descendants may have lived on under another name, one never connected back to the cities they left. Each theory answers part of the mystery, but none explains everything. Nature can devastate, but it rarely erases memory. War can destroy, but it often preserves its own record of conquest. Assimilation can absorb, but total overriding is rare. The evidence we have suggests a sequence: environmental stress followed by human intervention, followed by a campaign of historical removal. The implications are sobering. If the same forces, disaster, conflict, political manipulation converged today, how much of our own civilization could be made to vanish? How many centuries would it take before even our names were gone? Our monuments buried, our faces unknown. The fate of this lost people is not an ancient curiosity. It is a warning. The truth may be buried under layers of both earth and intent, and perhaps that is why the question persists. Was it Earth's wrath or man's hand? The most likely answer is that it was both intertwined, each amplifying the other until nothing was left, but dust scattered across the centuries waiting for us to notice. For centuries, the memory of this civilization remained locked beneath soil, stone, and silence. But in the modern age, the earth has begun to give up its secrets in ways that even the most carefully guarded archives cannot control. It is no longer just the pick and shovel of archaeologists that unearth the past. It is the unblinking eye of technology. The breakthrough began quietly with satellite imaging. What early explorers missed and official maps erased, satellites could now capture from hundreds of kilometers above the Earth. Aerial photos revealed faint geometric outlines in fields, strange discolorations in soil, and shadowy depressions that matched the grids of buried streets. farmers who had plowed their land for decades without incident were startled to learn that straight lines visible from the air cut directly across their property lines, too perfect to be natural. Then came LiDAR light detection and ranging, a technology capable of seeing through dense forest canopies to reveal the shapes of what lies beneath, in regions thought to be untouched wilderness. LiDAR scans exposed vast rectilinear patterns, unmistakably artificial. Hills once assumed to be natural were revealed as massive terraced platforms. Networks of causeways connected settlements across miles of difficult terrain. In one case, a dense jungle concealed an entire urban complex larger than many medieval European capitals. The contrast between these discoveries and the official historical narrative could not be sharper. History books still spoke of the region as sparsely inhabited, dotted only with small villages and transient camps. Now technology showed sprawling cities, advanced infrastructure, and evidence of coordinated regional planning. The sheer scale alone shattered the idea that this civilization was peripheral or minor. It was not a footnote. It had been a central chapter hidden in plain sight, but the reaction from institutions was far from celebratory. At first, some results were embraced, even publicized, as long as they could be framed as belonging to known cultures. Sites that didn't fit the accepted timeline or style were quietly reclassified, their scans withheld from the public. In some cases, high-resolution LiDAR data was made available to researchers for only a short window before being restricted under claims of data protection or national security. Archaeologists who attempted to publish findings linking the new imagery to the erased civilization found themselves facing delays in peer review, rejection from journals, and sudden funding cuts. Some were accused of overinterpretation, others of chasing fringe theories. A few saw their excavation permits revoked with local authorities citing environmental concerns, the same concerns that had been ignored when mining or logging companies operated in the same areas. This suppression is not just about protecting old narratives, it is about control, acknowledging the scale and sophistication revealed by these technologies would force a rewrite of the history of the region, one that could challenge political boundaries, cultural ownership, and even claims to heritage sites. If the erased civilization is recognized, questions of descent and inheritance inevitably follow. Which modern groups have the right to call themselves the heirs of its legacy? Who gets to claim its artifacts, its lands, its story? There is also an economic dimension. Many of the newly revealed sites lie in areas earmarked for resource extraction or development. Official recognition could trigger heritage protections, halting lucrative projects. In such cases, the simplest way to avoid legal complications is to avoid acknowledging the significance of the sites at all. Yet, despite resistance, the revelations keep coming. Independent researchers equipped with increasingly affordable drones and off-the-shelf sensors have begun mapping their own scans. Hobbyist archaeologists have compared old expedition sketches with satellite images, finding uncanny matches that confirm early explorers' suppressed reports. In one instance, an amateur team identified a massive buried harbor structure along a silted coastline, a feature absent from every modern map, but perfectly matching descriptions from a 19th-century travelogue. These unwelcome revelations have a cumulative effect. Each discovery by itself could be dismissed, but together they form a growing body of evidence too large to ignore. The erased civilization is re-emerging not through official channels, but through a global network of individuals unwilling to let the past remain buried. The more technology advances, the harder it becomes to keep the truth contained. The contrast is now between two histories, running in parallel. The official history remains static, repeated in textbooks and tourist brochures. The unofficial history grows richer with every scan, every image, every comparison. One is guarded by institutions, the other spreads in forums open source. Archives and late-night conversations among researchers who know what they have seen but cannot yet prove beyond bureaucratic doubt. It is telling that some of the most significant breakthroughs have come from technology never intended for archaeology. Agricultural surveys, infrastructure planning, even climate change monitoring have generated data that accidentally exposed the civilization's footprint. In one case, a company testing flood mapping software over a river basin inadvertently captured the perfect outline of a walled city beneath farmland. The images were quietly shared among employees before being locked behind a corporate firewall. Ultimately, the unwelcome nature of these revelations lies in their potential to collapse. The wall between speculation and fact. For centuries, the lost civilization could be dismissed as legend, conspiracy, or anomaly. Now it is increasingly visible, measurable, mappable, undeniable. The remaining barrier is not the absence of evidence, but the willingness to accept it. And that is the irony. The same tools that make modern society more interconnected, more informed, and more accountable are the tools pulling this civilization back into the light. Technology, indifferent to political agendas, is doing what generations of controlled narratives could not undo. The day is coming when the scanned grids, the terraces, the harbors, and the causeways will be stitched into a single unbroken map, and the world will see the civilization that history tried to erase. When that happens, the question will no longer be whether it existed, but why we were made to forget it in the first place. When a civilization is erased from the record, we imagine it as gone, as though it vanished entirely, leaving only ruins. But history has a way of carrying fragments forward, even when the name and story are lost. Traditions, symbols, words, and techniques can survive in disguise, woven into the fabric of later societies so seamlessly that we forget they once belonged to someone else. For this lost civilization, those fragments may be all around us, hiding in plain sight. The first clues come from art and architecture. Across the region, and even in lands far from the civilization's suspected homeland, we find decorative motifs identical to those carved into the stones of their ruined cities. Spirals enclosed in triangles, sunburst patterns ringed by small dots, stylized birds with wings spread wide. In official histories, these designs are credited to other cultures described as regional or indigenous to their later adopters. Yet side-by-side comparisons reveal that in the older ruins these motifs appear fully developed, while in the younger cultures they appear suddenly without the gradual evolution one would expect. The contrast is revealing. When styles evolve naturally, they change. Slowly, a curve becomes sharper, a line more elaborate, a pattern adapted for new materials. But in this case, the designs appear in later cultures almost unchanged, as though they were imported wholesale. It suggests not influence from afar, but inheritance, the continuation of a visual language long after its creators were gone. Language itself holds more secrets. Linguists studying the oldest layers of certain regional dialects have identified words that seem to come from nowhere. Orphan words with no relation to the surrounding languages. Many of these words describe tools, agricultural practices, or ceremonial objects also found in the ruins. One word still used to describe a type of ceremonial drum has a root form nearly identical to inscriptions on temple walls from the lost civilization. The connection is rarely made in mainstream scholarship, but among linguists willing to look outside official boundaries, it is a striking match. Even in everyday customs, echoes remain. In some rural communities, harvest festivals feature dances performed. In concentric circles around a central fire, anthropologists note that these patterns mirror the layout of certain ceremonial plazas in the ruins. In one coastal village, fishermen still build boats with a distinctive double prow design the same, shape depicted on carved reliefs of ships in the lost civilization's ports. The villagers insist it is just tradition, unaware that the design may have been perfected centuries before by a people whose name they have never heard. The persistence of these elements raises an uncomfortable question. If so much survived, how thorough was the erasure really? The answer may lie in the nature of cultural suppression. When conquerors seek to erase a people, they often target the overt symbols, the names, the monuments, the leaders' faces, while leaving practical knowledge intact if it serves a purpose. Agricultural techniques, ship designs, weaving patterns, these are useful and can be absorbed without preserving their origin. Over generations, their connection to the original culture is forgotten, even as the techniques themselves continue to shape daily life. This cultural shadow can extend into belief systems. In certain mountain shrines, rituals are performed that bear little resemblance to the dominant religion of the region. Offerings of black stones arranged in specific patterns are left beside flowing water. Oral tradition says these rites ensure the sun will return after the shortest day. Archaeological evidence shows that similar offerings in identical arrangements were made in the temples of the lost civilization during solstice festivals. The continuity is too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Even political systems may carry the imprint of the erased people. Some later city-states in the region adopted a council-based governance model with power shared among representatives from different districts rather than concentrated in a single monarch. This arrangement is unusual in the context of neighboring monarchies, but relief carvings from the lost civilization show assemblies of seated figures, each holding a staff or emblem of authority, gathered in a circle. If the later councils were indeed descended from this tradition, they may represent the survival of a political philosophy long after the society that created it was destroyed. The contrast between these living shadows and the official narrative is sharp. We are told that these customs, words, and designs belong wholly to the cultures in which they are now found. To link them to a lost civilization would require admitting that such a civilization existed and that it contributed far more to the region's development than is currently acknowledged. For some, that admission would be harmless. For others, it could threaten carefully curated identities and historical claims. Yet the shadow is there, and it grows more visible the more we look for it. Scholars outside the mainstream have begun mapping these cultural survivals, creating networks of connections that span hundreds of miles and thousands of years. They find that the patterns, linguistic, artistic, ritualistic, radiate outward from the very areas where the ruins lie buried. The further from the center, the weaker, the imprint. But the path is clear. Perhaps the most powerful realization is that these shadows represent the resilience of human memory. Even in the face of deliberate erasure, some part of a people's identity can survive, hidden in the rhythm of a song, in the curve of a boat's hull, in the turn of a phrase. It may be stripped of its name and origin, but it endures, waiting for someone to recognize it for what it is. And when we do recognize it, the shadow becomes something more, a bridge through it. We can begin to restore what was lost, not just in artifacts and dates, but in the living culture that continues unknowingly to carry the legacy forward. It is proof that the erased civilization was never entirely gone. It was here all along, speaking to us in a language we forgot we understood. Reconstructing the final days of a civilization erased from history is like piecing together the ending of a book with half the last chapter torn out. The ruins give us setting and characters. The trade goods, technologies, and cultural shadows give us plot threads. But the moment of disappearance, the point where their story becomes silence, is a mosaic of fragmentary evidence and haunting questions. Archaeology shows that the end came unevenly. Some cities appear to have been abandoned quickly, their streets swept clean of valuables, their buildings left standing. Others show signs of deliberate dismantling, walls pulled apart, foundations broken. A few bear scars of fire and violence, charred beams, collapsed towers, scattered human remains. This suggests that the end was not a single catastrophic event, but a series of collapses and removals unfolding over decades, perhaps even centuries. The environmental record offers one layer of the story core samples from nearby lakes indicate. A prolonged drought in the period leading up to the collapse, agricultural output likely fell, placing stress on both city and countryside. At the same time, evidence of massive flooding appears in coastal and river sites, perhaps caused by shifting weather patterns or seismic events. Such instability could have disrupted trade networks and made the population vulnerable, and vulnerability invites opportunity. Weapon fragments found in multiple sites hint at conflict, some matching designs. From foreign powers, others seemingly native burned layers in certain administrative buildings suggest targeted destruction. Archives, torched governance centers destroyed. These were not random acts of looting. They were strikes aimed at the organs of control. The removal of leadership, whether by invaders or internal rivals, could have fractured the unity of the civilization. One theory paints the picture this way. As climate pressures weakened harvests and trade, rival powers moved in, dismantling the civilization's political core. Some cities fell to siege or assault, others surrendered under negotiated terms that included the relocation or absorption of their populations. The conquerors then systematically dismantled monuments, removed inscriptions, and erased the visual identity of the people to prevent any resurgence of unity. Yet even this explanation does not capture the deliberate thoroughness of the erasure. Natural disasters and conquest can explain abandoned streets and toppled walls. They cannot fully explain why the very memory of the civilization was erased from surrounding records. For that, we must consider that the destruction was not just physical, but informational, a campaign to control the narrative of the region's past. The absence of survivors' accounts in neighboring cultures' records is one of the most troubling signs. When refugees flee a fallen city, they usually bring their stories with them. But here, no such voices appear, at least not in recognizable form. This suggests either that survivors were prevented from telling their story or that their identity was deliberately obscured as they were absorbed into new populations. Some evidence supports the assimilation theory. Genetic studies in certain modern communities show traces of ancestry linked to skeletal remains from the ruins, despite no historical connection being recorded. Linguistic orphan words in these communities correspond to objects and practices found in the lost cities. If the people were scattered and absorbed, the remnants of their identity may have been deliberately disguised, ensuring their descendants would not even know who they were. The contrast between the bustling life reconstructed from the cities and the abruptness of their disappearance is chilling. One-season workshops were producing goods for distant markets. The next production stopped. Market stalls stood empty. Ships no longer left the harbors. The economic web that connected them to the outside world unraveled almost overnight. In the archaeological record, it's a cliff edge, a sudden drop from abundance to nothing. In some places, the final chapter is written in haunting detail. In a small inland town, excavators found a row of houses with personal belongings left as if their owners had simply walked away, a half-carved wooden figurine, an unfinished pot on a wheelbread still in an oven. The town's central well had been filled in deliberately, perhaps to render the site unusable to those who might come after. There is no sign of struggle, no mass graves. It is the quietest kind of disappearance and perhaps the most unsettling. In coastal settlements, the evidence points to forced evacuation. Large storage jars, too, heavy to move easily, were smashed rather than abandoned intact, a tactic often used to deny supplies to enemies. Harbors were blocked with rubble quays dismantled. These are acts of strategic retreat, suggesting the people may have been relocated or driven inland under pressure. There is also the possibility of a cultural exodus, a decision by the civilization's leaders to leave rather than be conquered. Myths from distant regions, speak of builders from the setting sun arriving with knowledge, of stonework and irrigation, only to fade into local populations after a few generations. Whether these are echoes of reality or later inventions, they hint at a diaspora fragments of the civilization carried far from its homeland. The erasure that followed ensured that wherever the survivors went, they would not be recognized as such. Without their name, without their monuments, without their written language, they became invisible in the historical record. And perhaps that was the point too, make their past unreachable even to themselves. The final disappearance, then, was not just an event, but a process. First, environmental instability weakened their foundation, then human rivals dismantled their political and economic systems. Finally, a campaign of erasure, deliberate, coordinated, and sustained, removed their identity from history. By the time the dust settled, the civilization existed only in unmarked ruins, scattered artifacts, and the faintest of cultural shadows, and yet even in this silence they resisted complete annihilation. Their streets still lie beneath the soil, their symbols still appear in the art of others, their techniques still shape boats, cloth, and harvests. Their DNA still runs in the veins of people who do not know their name. This is perhaps the deepest irony of their erasure in trying to remove them completely. Their destroyers ensured their mystery would endure. A forgotten civilization can be rediscovered. An erased one demands to be. When the last city fell silent, when the last official record was destroyed, it might have seemed that they had been erased forever, but the earth is patient, and so is the truth. And now, centuries later, their disappearance is no longer the end of their story. It is the beginning of ours in finding them again.